Dates in this article are according to the Julian calendar. Sources using the old-style calendar will need to be adjusted by adding 10 days. The Synod of Dort was an international synod held in Dordrecht in 1618–1619 by the Dutch Reformed Church, to settle a divisive controversy initiated by the rise of Arminianism. The first meeting was on the 13th of November 1618 and the final meeting, the 154th, was on the 9th of May 1619. Voting representatives from 8 foreign Reformed churches were also invited. Dort was a contemporary English term for the town of Dordrecht. In 2014, the first entire critical edition of the Acts and Documents of the Synod was published. Background: there had been previous provincial synods of Dort, and a national synod in 1578. For that reason the 1618 meeting is sometimes called the Second Synod of Dort. The acts of the synod were tied to political intrigues that arose during the 12 Years' Truce, a pause in the Dutch war with Spain. After the death of Jacob Arminius, his followers presented objections to the Belgic Confession and the teaching of John Calvin, Theodore Beza, and the followers. These objections were published in a document called the Remonstrance of 1610, and the Arminians were therefore also known as Remonstrants. They taught election on the basis of foreseen faith, a universal atonement, resistible grace, and the possibility of lapse from grace. The opposing Calvinists, Gomarists, led by Franciscus Gomarus of the University of Leiden, became known as the Contra-Remonstrants. The Arminians were perceived as ready to compromise with the Spanish, whereas the Dutch Calvinists were not. So Arminianism was considered by some to be political treason. In 1617–8 there was a pamphlet war, and Francis van Arsens expressed the view that the Arminians were working for Philip IV of Spain. Planning for a national synod was begun by Adrian Pauw in March 1618. Before that, there had been a debate as to whether the synod should be national, as the Contra-Remonstrants wished, or provincial for Holland, as the Remonstrants argued. This decision was worked out in 1617, with outside input from the English ambassador Dudley Carleton. The purpose of the synod was to settle the controversy over Arminianism. It was subsequently alleged that the outcome had already been decided. According to Frederick Calder, condemnation was determined before the National Synod met. On the other hand, beyond the condemnation of the Arminians, the theological formulations of the Canons of the Synod by no means gave support to all the Gomarists wanted. The more extreme views of Dutch Calvinists were moderated in the detailed debates. Delegates. The Synod had members representing Reformed groups from continental Europe, as well as from the British Isles. Among these groups were also Anglican delegates from the Church of England and the Church of Scotland. Proceedings. Simon Episcopia was spokesman of the 14 Remonstrants who were summoned before the Synod in 1618. At the opening of the Synod, Episcopius asked to speak. Episcopius insisted on being permitted to begin with a refutation of the Calvinistic doctrines, especially that of reprobation, hoping that, by placing his objections to this doctrine in front of all the rest, he might excite such prejudice against the other articles of the system, as to secure the popular voice in his favor. The Synod, however, very properly reminded him that, as the Remonstrants were accused of departing from the Reformed faith, they were bound first to justify themselves by giving scriptural proof in support of their opinions. The Arminians would not submit to this plan of procedure because it destroyed the whole scheme of argument and were thus compelled to withdraw. Upon their departure, the Synod proceeded without them. Quote, He concluded by expressing his dissatisfaction with the organization of the assembly, and that the contra-remonstrance had prevented an accurate representation of the Arminian supporters in the Dutch Reformed Church with votes in the Synod. A delegation of Episcopius Bernard Twinglo and Johannes Anelde Corvinus called on the Church of England representatives, and other coming from outside, asking for support and giving written accounts of the context. After that, a month was spent on procedural matters concerning the remonstrants. They were finally ejected from the Synod at session 57 on the 14th of January. The Canons of Dort. The Synod concluded with a rejection of the Arminian views, and set forth a Reformed doctrine on each point, namely, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints. These are sometimes referred to as the 5 points of Calvinism. The decision of the Synod of Dort on the 5 main points of doctrine in dispute in the Netherlands, popularly known as the Canons of Dort, is the explanation of the judicial decision of the Synod. In the original preface, the decision is called a judgment, in which both the true view agreeing with God's word concerning the aforesaid 5 points of doctrine is explained, and the false view disagreeing with God's word is rejected. Aftermath. The 13 remonstrant ministers, including Episcopius, had been charged to remain in Dort until further instruction. On the 20th of May 1619, the remonstrant ministers who had been present were summoned by the lay commissioners of the Synod and directed to abstain from ministerial activities such as preaching, exhorting, administering the sacraments, and visiting the sick. Furthermore, Episcopius was commanded not to write letters or books promoting the doctrines of the remonstrants. The remonstrants agreed to refrain from ministering in the government-ordained churches, but confessed the duty to expound their doctrines wherever people would assemble to hear them. On the 5th of July, they were called to the States General Assembly, where they were requested to sign the Act of Cessation, the legalization of the order to desist from the ministry. When they refused to sign it, they were sentenced as disturbers of the public peace, and ordered to leave the United Provinces. However, in the 18th century, Arminian theology spread to England, where it became integral to the theology of the Methodist churches. Bible translation. The Synod also initiated an official Dutch Bible translation from the original languages that would be completed in 1637. Translators were appointed, and the States General were asked to fund the project. It had a lasting impact on the standard Dutch language, which was just then beginning to gain wider acceptance and developing a literary tradition. It would remain the standard translation in Protestant churches for more than 3 centuries and still is used in some sister churches of the Netherlands, Reformed congregations and similar, smaller denominations. Political impact. The Synod rejected the teachings of the remonstrants on the controverted points as falling outside the bounds of the Reformed confessions. They followed the political condemnation of the statesman Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, who had been the protector of the remonstrants, for the crime of general perturbation in the state of the nation, both in church and state. He was beheaded on the 13th of May 1619, only 4 days after the final meeting of the Synod. As consequence of the Arminian defeat, the jurist Hugo Grotius was given a life sentence in prison, but he escaped with the help of his wife. Both Van Oldenbarnevelt and Grotius had in fact been imprisoned since the 29th of August 1618.